In the scorching heat of a Mesopotamian summer, beneath the relentless sun of 53 BCE, the sands would soon drink the blood of one of Rome's greatest disasters. Here, in the desolate plains near a forgotten town called Carrhae, the most powerful empire the world had ever known was about to face a humiliation so complete, so devastating, that it would echo through the corridors of history for centuries to come. This is the story of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, whose insatiable hunger for glory led 7 legions into a trap from which few would ever return. But to understand how Rome's seemingly invincible war machine could be shattered in a single day, we must first journey back to the marble halls of the Eternal City, where 3 titans of power forged a secret alliance that would reshape the ancient world. For this was not merely a battle between armies. It was the collision of 2 civilizations, 2 ways of war, and 2 men whose ambitions would determine the fate of empires. In the shadows of the Roman Forum, where senators debated and citizens gathered, whispers spoke of the 3-headed monster. This was no mythical beast, but something far more dangerous. 3 of Rome's most powerful men, bound together by ambition and mutual necessity, had carved up the Republic between themselves like butchers dividing a carcass. Julius Caesar, the brilliant general conquering Gaul, Pompey the Great, whose victories had stretched Roman power to the very edges of the known world, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, whose wealth was so vast that it defied comprehension. Yet wealth, for all its power, could not buy what Crassus truly craved. While Caesar's name was sung in the taverns for his Gallic triumphs, and Pompey basked in the glory of his eastern conquests, Crassus remained in their shadow. His fortune was legendary, his political influence immense, but his military reputation rested on a single campaign against rebellious slaves. How could the richest man in Rome stand as an equal to conquerors of nations? The answer lay beyond the Euphrates, in the vast kingdom of Parthia, where riches beyond imagination awaited and military glory could finally be his. This hunger for recognition burned in Crassus like a fever. At 60 years of age, when most men thought of retirement and reflection, he dreamed of campaigns that would eclipse even Alexander's march to India. The Triumvirate had granted him Syria as his province, a posting that promised immense wealth from its trade routes and strategic position. But Syria was merely a stepping stone. Beyond its eastern borders lay Parthia, a realm that controlled the Silk Roads to China and commanded treasures that made even Crassus's fortune seem modest. The Parthian Empire was unlike any enemy Rome had previously encountered. Where Rome's legions had crushed the phalanxes of Greek kings and overwhelmed the tribal warriors of Gaul and Germania, Parthia represented something entirely different. This was a civilization as old and sophisticated as Rome itself, with its own proud traditions of warfare and statecraft. From the Mediterranean shores to the mountains of Bactria, from the Caucasus to the Persian Gulf, the Parthian banner flew over lands that had once belonged to Alexander's successors. But it was not merely the size of the Parthian realm that made it formidable. It was the way they fought. Where Roman warfare relied on the disciplined advance of heavy infantry, the clash of shield against shield, and the brutal efficiency of the gladius in close combat, the Parthians had perfected something entirely different. They were the masters of the horse and bow, warriors who could strike like lightning and vanish like smoke, leaving only death in their wake. At the heart of Parthian military might lay 2 distinct but complementary forces: the Cataphracts, heavy cavalry encased in scale armor that gleamed like dragonhide, rode horses equally protected by mail and bronze. These were the hammer that could shatter any line foolish enough to stand against their charge. But it was the horse archers who truly defined Parthian warfare. Mounted on swift horses, armed with powerful composite bows, they could rain death from distances that Roman javelins could never reach. Most terrifying of all was their signature tactic, the Parthian shot, where retreating horsemen would twist in their saddles to loose arrows at pursuing enemies, turning every retreat into another opportunity to kill. The man who commanded these forces was no mere barbarian chieftain, but a general whose tactical genius would soon be whispered in the same breath as Hannibal and Alexander. Surena, scion of one of Parthia's greatest noble houses, possessed not only the wealth to maintain a private army, but the strategic brilliance to use it with devastating effect. Ancient sources tell us he traveled with 1,000 camels for his baggage train and 200 carriages for his concubines, while 1,000 heavy cavalry and countless light horsemen formed his personal retinue. This was no mere commander, but a prince of war whose very presence on the battlefield could shift the balance of nations. When word reached the Parthian court that Roman legions were massing in Syria, King Orodes divided his forces with the calculated precision of a chess master. He would personally lead the main army north to punish Armenia for its alliance with Rome, while Surena would take a smaller force to observe and harass the Roman advance. It was a decision that spoke to either supreme confidence or fatal underestimation. No one, not even Orodes himself, expected Surena's relatively modest force to achieve more than delaying the Roman advance. Meanwhile, in the bustling streets of Antioch, Crassus assembled what he believed would be an unstoppable war machine. 7 full legions of Roman infantry, each man a veteran trained in the brutal efficiency that had conquered half the world. 4,000 light troops to screen the advance and exploit opportunities. Nearly 4,000 cavalry, including 1,000 Gallic horsemen, led by his beloved son Publius, fresh from their victories in Caesar's Gallic campaigns. In total, over 30,000 men marched under the Roman eagles, a force larger than any that had crossed into Parthian territory. The omens, however, spoke of disaster. As the army prepared to cross the Euphrates at Zeugma, the ancient ford that marked the boundary between the Roman and Parthian worlds, eagles fell from the sky and sacrificial animals fled the altars. The priests muttered of angry gods and inauspicious signs, but Crassus dismissed such superstitions. What could omens matter when he commanded the finest soldiers in the world and carried the wealth to hire any mercenary army he might need? Yet even as the legions crossed the muddy waters of the Euphrates, forces beyond their knowledge were already in motion. Ariamnes, the Osroene chieftain who had once served Pompey faithfully, now whispered lies into Crassus's ear. The route through Armenia was treacherous, he claimed. The mountain passes were too narrow for so large an army. Better to march through the open plains of Mesopotamia, where Roman discipline and organization could be brought to bear most effectively. It was advice that seemed reasonable, even wise, from a man whose knowledge of the region was unquestioned. What Crassus could not know was that Ariamnes had already been bought with Parthian gold. Every word was calculated to lead the Roman army into terrain where Surena's cavalry would have every advantage, where the very strengths that made the legions invincible would become fatal weaknesses. As spring gave way to summer and the Roman columns advanced deeper into Mesopotamia, they were not marching toward conquest, but toward the most carefully prepared trap in military history. The sun climbed higher as Crassus pushed his army deeper into the furnace of Mesopotamia. Behind them, the Euphrates grew smaller with each passing day, a thin line of green that marked the boundary between the world they knew and the vast emptiness that stretched ahead. The Roman columns moved with mechanical precision across the sun-baked plains, their armor glinting like a river of bronze and steel. But the landscape around them remained ominously empty. No birds sang in this desolation. No farmers tended fields. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. For weeks, they had encountered nothing but abandoned villages and empty wells. The very silence should have warned them, but Roman confidence ran deeper than caution. These were the legions that had crushed Gaul and humbled Germania. What could a few horse archers do against the disciplined might of Rome's finest? Yet as they marched, unseen eyes watched from distant ridges, and swift riders carried word of their every movement to Surena's camp. The Parthian commander had used these weeks well. While Crassus plodded through the desert, Surena had been weaving a web of intelligence and deception that would soon trap his prey. Local guides fed the Romans false information about water sources and safe routes. Merchants who appeared friendly carried detailed reports of Roman strength and disposition back to Parthian scouts. Most crucially, Surena had positioned his forces with the patience of a master hunter, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When that moment came, it arrived with the sudden violence of a desert storm. On the morning of June 9th, as the Roman vanguard crested a low rise near the town of Carrhae, the scouts who had been ranging ahead simply vanished. One moment, they were visible dots against the horizon. The next, they were gone, swallowed by the shimmering heat haze that danced across the plains. Then came the sound that would haunt Roman nightmares for generations, a low rumble at first, like distant thunder, but growing steadily louder and more distinct. The earth itself seemed to pulse with an alien rhythm. Thousands of war drums, beaten by invisible hands, filled the air with a sound unlike anything Roman ears had ever heard. It was not the clean note of Roman trumpets, or the wild war cries of barbarian tribes, but something deeper and more primal. The very sound seemed designed to crawl into a man's bones and shake his courage loose. Horses began to shy and stamp nervously. Even veteran centurions found their hands tightening unconsciously on their sword hilts. Then they appeared, emerging from the heat shimmer like phantoms given form. At first, just a thin line of horsemen on the horizon, so distant they might have been mirages. But the drumbeat grew stronger, and the line grew thicker, until it became clear that what approached was not a scouting party but an army. Yet it was an army unlike any the Romans had ever faced. No dense blocks of infantry, no siege engines or baggage trains stretching to the horizon, just cavalry, thousands upon thousands of mounted warriors flowing across the landscape like a tide of death. Crassus felt the first cold touch of doubt as he studied the approaching force through the dust and glare. This was not what his intelligence had promised. Ariamnes had spoken of a few thousand horsemen at most, raiders to be swept aside by disciplined legionaries. But what he saw before him was something far more dangerous. The enemy moved with a coordination that spoke of professional soldiers rather than tribal levies. Their formations shifted and flowed with the fluid grace of men who had spent their lives in the saddle. At their head rode a figure that commanded attention even at distance. Tall and straight in his saddle, his armor catching the sun like polished silver, Surena looked every inch the prince of war that he was. Behind him came his Cataphracts, heavy cavalry whose horses and riders alike were encased in gleaming scale armor. They moved like a steel avalanche, unstoppable and terrifying. But it was the cloud of lighter cavalry that surrounded them which truly caught the Roman eye. Horse archers by the thousand, their bows ready, their quivers full, their faces hidden behind veils that made them look like spirits of the desert itself. The psychological warfare began before the first arrow was loosed. Surena had hidden the true size of his force behind his advance guard, allowing only a fraction of his strength to be visible as they approached. To the Romans, it appeared they faced a manageable enemy, perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 horsemen, but as the distance closed, more and more riders seemed to materialize from the heat haze until the entire horizon writhed with mounted figures. Then came the revelation that would shake Roman confidence to its core. At a signal from their commander, the Cataphracts threw off the dark cloaks that had concealed their armor. In an instant, what had appeared to be a modest force of lightly armed cavalry was revealed to be something far more formidable. The sun struck their scaled armor like lightning, sending blinding flashes of light dancing across the battlefield. Horses and riders alike gleamed like creatures forged from precious metal, their lances rising like a forest of steel points. The sight was calculated to inspire terror, and it succeeded. Even veteran legionaries who had faced the war elephants of Pyrrhus and the chariots of British kings found themselves shaken by this display. Here was an enemy that combined the mobility of light cavalry with the striking power of heavy infantry, something Roman tactical doctrine had never been designed to counter. Worse still, the endless drumbeat continued, a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to drain Roman will while filling their enemies with supernatural energy. Crassus now faced the first critical decision of the battle, and the weight of command pressed down on him like a physical burden. His lieutenant Cassius, a man whose military experience stretched back decades, urged the traditional deployment. Form the legions in their standard battle line, infantry in the center with cavalry on the flanks. It was a formation that had won 100 battles from Spain to Syria, proven and reliable as sunrise itself. But doubt gnawed at the Roman commander. The enemy before him was not fighting by the rules he understood. Traditional tactics assumed an enemy who would eventually close to sword range, where Roman discipline and superior equipment would tell. These Parthians showed no such intention. Already their horse archers were beginning to spread out, threatening to envelope the Roman flanks entirely. A standard battle line would be stretched too thin, vulnerable to exactly the kind of encirclement that Parthian mobility made possible. In a moment that would be debated by military historians for centuries, Crassus changed his mind. Instead of the proven line formation, he ordered his army into a hollow square, 12 cohorts to each face, the cavalry protected within, the formation bristling with spears and shields like a giant hedgehog. It was a defensive posture, designed to prevent flanking attacks and provide mutual support from all sides. In theory, it was the perfect counter to mobile cavalry tactics. In practice, it was a trap disguised as security. The square formation surrendered the initiative entirely to the enemy, allowing them to choose when and where to attack. Worse still, it compressed the Roman advantage in numbers into a smaller space, negating their ability to bring superior force to bear at the decisive point. Most fatally of all, it was a formation designed for survival rather than victory. And in the desert of Mesopotamia, survival was not enough. As the Roman square took shape with the mechanical precision of long practice, Surena studied his prey with the calculating eye of a master tactician. The Romans had done exactly what he had hoped they would do. They had abandoned their mobility, concentrated their forces into a single vulnerable target, and handed him the initiative. Now came the moment to begin the deadly dance that would destroy them piece by piece, arrow by arrow, until nothing remained but carrion for the desert scavengers. The trap was about to spring, but Surena was in no hurry. Like a master chess player contemplating his final moves, he allowed the tension to build while his forces completed their deployment. The Romans watched in growing unease as more and more cavalry appeared from seemingly empty desert, materializing as if conjured by some dark sorcery. What had begun as a manageable encounter was transforming into something far more ominous with each passing moment. The Parthian commander had spent years perfecting this moment. Every detail had been rehearsed, every contingency planned. His horse archers spread out in a vast crescent that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon itself, while the Cataphracts formed a steel-tipped spear point aimed directly at the Roman heart. Between them moved supply trains that would prove crucial in the hours to come, though their importance remained hidden from Roman eyes. Thousands of camels carried not just provisions, but something far more deadly: arrows, endless supplies of arrows that would turn this battle into a massacre. When Surena finally gave the signal to begin, it came not with the thunder of charging horses that Romans expected, but with something far more subtle and infinitely more terrifying. The horse archers began their deadly carousel, circling the Roman square at distances that rendered Roman weapons useless, while keeping their own composite bows well within killing range. The arrows began to fall like deadly rain, each shaft seeking the gaps in Roman armor with supernatural precision. These were not the crude missiles that Roman legions had faced from barbarian tribes. Parthian arrows were works of art and engineering, their bone and bronze points designed to penetrate mail and find flesh. Worse still, they came from bows that had been perfected over centuries of warfare on the steppes, weapons that could drive an arrow through a bronze shield at ranges where Roman javelins fell harmlessly to earth. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Roman soldiers found themselves under attack by an enemy they could not reach, could not close with, could not fight in any meaningful way. Crassus ordered his light troops forward, hoping to drive off the horse archers and give his legions room to maneuver. But the skirmishers who had served Rome so well in other campaigns found themselves hopelessly outmatched. The Parthians simply fell back beyond javelin range, then wheeled and returned with interest, their arrows finding targets among men who had nowhere to hide. Those who pressed forward too eagerly were cut off and surrounded, disappearing into the swirling mass of enemy cavalry like stones dropped into deep water. The Roman square contracted under the relentless pressure, men pressing together for whatever protection their shields might offer. But the famous testudo formation, that turtle of locked shields which had protected Roman armies for generations, became a death trap in this alien form of warfare. Packed together like cattle in a pen, the legionaries could do nothing but endure as arrows found every gap, every weakness in their defenses. The wounded fell among their comrades, their cries adding to the growing desperation that spread through the ranks like poison. Yet even as death rained down upon them, Roman discipline held. These were not raw recruits, but veterans of a dozen campaigns, men who had stood firm when Gallic chariots thundered toward them and Germanic warriors howled for their blood. They maintained their formation, kept their shields locked, and waited for the order that would send them charging forward to close with an enemy they could finally fight with sword and spear. But that order never came, for their enemy refused to give them the battle they understood. Hours passed under the merciless sun, and still the arrows fell. The Parthians showed no sign of exhaustion, no indication that their supply of missiles was anything less than infinite. This was the genius of Surena's preparation revealed in its full horror. While Roman armies carried enough javelins for a single engagement, the Parthian baggage train ensured that their horse archers would never lack for ammunition. Camels laden with bundled arrows moved constantly between the supply base and the fighting line, keeping every quiver filled and every bow busy. The heat became another enemy, as brutal as the arrows themselves. Trapped within their armor, pressed together in the suffocating confines of the square, Roman soldiers began to collapse from heat exhaustion even before wounds could claim them. Water became more precious than gold, but there was no relief to be found in that furnace of metal and flesh. Men who had marched across half the world now found themselves dying of thirst within sight of their enemies, unable to break free from the formation that had become their prison. It was then that Crassus made the decision that would seal his fate and doom his son. Unable to endure the passive slaughter any longer, he ordered Publius forward with the cream of his cavalry. The young man was to lead 1,300 Gallic horsemen, supported by archers and picked legionaries, in a desperate attempt to break the deadlock. It seemed like tactical genius to the desperate Romans watching from the square. The Gauls were superb cavalry, veterans of Caesar's campaigns who had broken Germanic tribes and scattered British chariots. Surely they could sweep away these desert horsemen and give the legions room to advance. Publius embraced the mission with the eager courage of youth and the pride of a Roman noble. Here at last was the chance for decisive action, the opportunity to prove that Roman valor could triumph over any enemy. As he led his men forward, the horse archers seemed to give way before them, retreating in apparent disorder. The Gauls pressed their pursuit with growing confidence, convinced they had finally found the key to victory. Behind them, the watching legions cheered as their cavalry disappeared into the swirling dust clouds that marked the edge of the battlefield. But Surena had orchestrated this moment as carefully as everything else. The retreating horse archers were not fleeing in panic, but executing a planned withdrawal, drawing the Roman cavalry away from the main body and into a carefully prepared killing ground. Once Publius and his men were sufficiently isolated, the trap was sprung with devastating efficiency. The Cataphracts, held in reserve for precisely this moment, charged into the scattered Gallic cavalry, while horse archers cut off every avenue of retreat. The battle that followed was as brief as it was brutal. The Gauls fought with desperate courage, their long swords flashing as they tried to break through the ring of enemies that surrounded them. But they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and fighting on ground chosen by their enemies. Their horses, magnificent though they were, could not match the endurance of mounts bred for desert warfare. Their armor, adequate for European battlefields, offered little protection against the specialized weapons of professional Parthian soldiers. Publius himself fought like a hero from the old stories, his sword cutting down enemy after enemy as he tried to rally his men and break free from the trap. But heroism alone could not overcome the mathematics of the situation. Surrounded and outnumbered, his force was systematically destroyed piece by piece. When the end came, it came with the stoic dignity that Romans prized above life itself. Rather than face capture and the shame that would bring to his family name, Publius fell on his sword, choosing death over dishonor in the manner of his ancestors. The sight that greeted Crassus when the dust finally settled was one that would haunt him for the few hours of life that remained. A Parthian rider approached the Roman square under the protection of a spear point, and upon that spear was mounted a trophy that struck the Roman commander like a physical blow. His son's head, the face still recognizable despite the wounds of battle, stared down at him with sightless eyes. The young man who had ridden out with such hope and courage was now nothing more than a gruesome ornament to enemy victory. The sands of Carrhae had drunk deeply that day, swallowing the blood of legions and the dreams of empire alike. Of the 30,000 men who had crossed the Euphrates with such confidence, barely 10,000 would ever see Rome again. Crassus himself would not be among them, meeting his end in the desert he had sought to conquer. The battle that was meant to crown his legacy instead became his epitaph, proving that even the mightiest empires can be humbled by the perfect storm of arrogance, deception, and tactical genius.